Hi everybody, meteorologist Joe Chaffee. Welcome to tonight's Joe Chaffee Weather Show, which is going to be all things Hurricane Dorian. And one of the things that occurred today reminded me of something with respect to tropical systems, and I think the practical analogy might be with regards to an ordinary thunderstorm, and that is this. Probably the worst time to be caught in a thunderstorm is while it's in its development phase, particularly if it's on its way to becoming a severe storm. That's when you get a ton of lightning strikes and all sorts of crazy things happen. Well, similar to that, as was told to me by one of the flyers of the Hurricane Hunter aircraft, that it is far more difficult to go into a storm that's in a that is undergoing a strengthening phase, as opposed to when it's peaked in intensity, or perhaps it might be on a weakening phase. And this is what happened today to the Virgin Islands, because the storm Dorian began to strengthen overnight, and while it was sitting over the Virgin Islands today, we had wind gusts, sustained winds up of hurricane force at St. Thomas, and gusts that I saw unofficially to 90 or even 100 miles an hour in some places. They happened to be when it happened to move over the Virgin Islands and over St. Thomas while it was going through its strengthening phase. And that strengthening phase has continued this evening with top winds now at 80 miles an hour. And if we last the live stream until 8 o'clock, we probably will have the 8 o'clock advisory to see what they do with it. But the first thing I'm going to start off with is the current surface map and radar. Well, you know what? I was going to start with it, and now it just apparently reset itself. So let's see if I can get this to work. The best laid plans of mice and men sometimes. All right, so this is all set. The boundaries are all set. U.S. states. All right, apparently I'm going to have a problem with this. So you know what? We'll just let it refresh, and we'll start from scratch, and I'll come back to it a bit later on. All right, so let's instead start off with the satellite loop of Dorian, and I have a floater image here, a floater in that when you every 6 or 7 hours or so they move the geography. That's the jump that you see, but this is a tight shot of Dorian, which is now north of the Virgin Islands and north of Puerto Rico. And if I'm looking at this correctly, I can almost see the hint of some kind of eye developing. I'm going to give it a quick refresh here to make sure we have the latest frames. And all right, load away, and it should loop here in a moment. Here we go. It's trying. I'm sorry, folks. Sometimes this happens. If there's a lot of traffic, you wind up, getting it to be a little bit slow. It does look as if when it goes over to the enhanced view here, if you take a look really close, you can almost see an eye feature that pops up. So apparently this system still has some gaining to do as far as strength is concerned. Important developments today is the fact that, and actually this was going back to yesterday when the center reformed further north once it got to the other side of the Windward Islands. That was very important because that center reforming a little further north by about 50 or 60 miles has made the difference here in the storm going over the Virgin Islands as opposed to going over Puerto Rico or even the Dominican Republic. It turned to the northwest a bit faster. That has kept the core of the storm basically over open water with a minimal amount of impact to to the land area of Puerto Rico, but the Puerto Rico itself with its mountainous terrain did not have a huge impact with regards to this disrupting the circulation. So with that in mind, it has given this storm certainly an extra leg up. And I think with conditions going forward remaining favorable for intensification. There is a lack of wind shear in the upper atmosphere, but also the one big issue with this was the fact that we had all this dry air that was surrounding it. Well, that dry air is now not a problem. It is gone, and it will now we're going to be going into a moist environment going forward, and this is going to help facilitate the storm even further. We have a big upper high. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but this is the HWRF model, which is one of the hurricane models. It's not infallible by any stretch of the imagination. It gives us one view of what's going on, but I want to spend some time talking about exactly that. What is happening in the upper atmosphere, because I think at the end of the day, as I said yesterday, that's really what this is going to ultimately boil down to. Here is the wider satellite view where you can actually see off the Carolina coast the spinning exposed center of Tropical Depression Erin. The thunderstorms last night, right after when we did the live stream last night, I made it a point to tell you how the thunderstorms, it looked like the center, the southeastern quadrant was getting under some heavier thunderstorms. Well, the Hurricane Center upgraded this to a tropical storm last night based on that. And then they downgraded it back this morning to a tropical depression because the center has gotten exposed again. And in fact, northerly wind shear, northerly winds in the upper atmosphere, blowing all the cloud tops from north to south. And that's what you're seeing that's left down well east of the Georgia and Florida coast down into just east of the Bahamas. And now here we have Dorian coming into the Atlantic north of Puerto Rico. There's an upper low to the northeast of it that's pulling away. And this system with the northerly shear is going to be dropping southward. So with the big ridge that's building here across the Atlantic and back into the southeast coast, this is going to be the driver of Dorian going forward. So I think it really, at this point, boils down to how far north does it gain at the moment while it's moving northwestward until it turns and moves more west-northwest. And that is going to really determine where in Florida you're going to see a landfalling hurricane, because I really believe that that's where the target zone lies here. It's going to be somewhere along the state, in the state of Florida, I believe from Jacksonville down to Miami. Unless we see evidence that a northerly a component of motion is going to continue for a longer period of time and that the ridge that's building doesn't build as strongly, then I have to lean to that zone. If it looks like it's going to move a little bit more to the north before it makes the turn, then maybe we'll push the zone up a bit further to the north. Overnight models, the GFS specifically, was giving you that idea, but they went right back, and they actually line up fairly well tonight. All the models do with regards to where the track is going to be. And the Hurricane Center has kind of taken the middle ground. It's a little bit to the south of the GFS and a bit to the north of the European. Notice that on their latest forecast, as of the 5 p.m. advisory, which is at 18.8 north and 65.5 west, maximum sustained winds are 80 miles an hour. The Hurricane Center is north of the Virgin Islands at the moment, and it's north of the northeastern coast of Puerto Rico, moving northwest at 14. That at about 310 degrees or so, 315. And it continues on that course until early Friday morning, and then we start to see this bend back to the more west-northwest. The Hurricane Center strengthening it to a major hurricane by 2 p.m. Saturday. I think it's possible that we could get there beforehand, which that's another issue to think about, is the fact that if you do wind up seeing this strengthen faster, that might actually produce a more northward component of motion as we reach higher up into the atmosphere to look at the steering. But for now, let's respect the forecast of the Hurricane Center and go with this idea that it waits until maybe Friday night or Saturday to become a major hurricane. And then pretty much west-northwest from there, looks like it wants to take it inland to the Florida coast around Cape Canaveral. Notice the uncertainty the cone of uncertainty up to Georgia, to about Savannah or so on the north side, the Keys on the south side. But I really believe it's going to be somewhere along the Florida coast where we're going to ultimately see the final landfall. Now, the hurricane track model guidance today actually shifted to the south of last night's, and most of the landfalls occur pretty much right on the central Florida coast. You do have a few outliers that are a bit further to the northwest, and that's it. The majority of them are concentrated in the central Florida coast. And I want to bring up the intensity guidance here because it's kind of interesting when you look at this. So you have a vast majority of the models keeping this a Category 1 or a Category 2 hurricane, but you do have a number of them, particularly after 60 hours, going to a Category 3, and 2 of them take it to a Category 4. So you do have, I would say, half the models make this a major hurricane, and all of them have them at these are kind of weird, these first two, because they drop it down to a tropical storm from now till later tomorrow, and then bring it back up to hurricane strength. There's no indication that's what's going to happen. But the intensity model guidance is pretty bullish, and also bullish for the idea that this is going to wind up being a major hurricane. So let's take a look. I'm going to start with the HWRF model to run this. I preloaded it because there's a problem tonight with getting into Tropical Tidbits website because he's so darn busy. But this map illustrates wind shear and the winds at the highest levels of the atmosphere up at 200 millibars, roughly about 30,000 feet. What you want to look at is the lines there, the thin lines with the arrows. That is indicative of what's going on pressure pattern-wise at that level of the atmosphere. And what we have is actually an upper high that is sitting over the hurricane, which creates a very, very good environment for strengthening, where the upper high over the top of it helps to evacuate the air up and out. And this is the structure of a hurricane. As we said, it's stronger at the bottom, weaker at the top. So you're going to see, if you see an upper high over it, that's usually a sign that it is going to strengthen, or at the very least, it's not going to weaken. And it carries that upper high right through its forecast period, but it's when you get to about 72 or 3 west, once it gets west of 70 west, the pressures on the HWRF start to really drop down, and it takes it down to the low 940s. Now look, I want to just put a big asterisk here, okay? Just because this HWRF model does this doesn't mean it's going to get down to a 940. I just think the takeaway is that if you're looking for support for a major hurricane, you certainly have it by looking at the wind field and the upper air here with this very strong anticyclone sitting right over the hurricane and moving along it as it moves into the state of Florida. This would be time-wise is sometime during Sunday morning or just after lunchtime on Sunday, according to the HWRF. Now, we were talking about the moisture, and again, we want to show you the difference between what we had as the maps load, and they're trying to load, and I'm trying to run them backwards. Okay, so remember, we had a storm that was completely surrounded by dry air at the mid levels, and this is what this map, this sequence of maps represent. The dark brown, that's all very dry air, relative humidities 40, 30, 20, 15%. Same, you see that on virtually surrounding the entire tropical storm before it moved over the Windward Islands. Now watch what happens from yesterday, where the dry air just gradually dissipates and the atmosphere gets increasingly more moist. And now that we're north of Puerto Rico, that moist atmosphere continues to increase as the hurricane heads west-northwestward. So it's going into an environment now that is going to be, at least from the standpoint of moisture, we're not going to have this dry air getting entrained in the circulation situation anymore. So we'll throw that negative factor out. So I think everything here says at this stage of the game that we are going to perhaps be dealing with a major hurricane. And being that this is the Labor Day holiday weekend, tomorrow being Thursday, I wonder whether at this time tomorrow, if nothing changes in terms of the outlook, that we may wind up seeing watches go up. And I would think that they might, because of the holiday weekend, they may go a little early. I'm guessing on my point, but it's just knowing the mindset of what they deal with and how they make decisions. I think that is certainly a possibility. So I want to jump down. I'm going to take the upper air at 500 millibars, and I think I'm going to switch models here. I'm going to go to the European. So just bear with me for a moment. I think this is all about where we're going to wind up with this is all about the upper high. And those of you on Patreon who saw the Weather in 10 video that you got this afternoon, which is a video I do just for Patreon members, it goes into this a bit more extensively. So I'm just going to bring the paint box up in a moment. But watch out in the Atlantic, okay, east of South Carolina, and you see that what looks like a finger and a little dot there. That's Bermuda. That's your upper high now that's going to be expanding westward. By the time we get to Sunday, you've got a closed upper high sitting off the North Carolina, South Carolina coast, about halfway between there and Bermuda. And that line, that 591 labeled line, the height line, remember, winds blow clockwise around highs. There's a east to west flow in the Atlantic from that ridge southward down to where Dorian is. So it really is going to respond to the ridge, and there's no weakness there that I can see that would suggest that maybe it's not going to move west northwest. That maybe it'll move more northwest or even turn to the north. It's going to be awfully hard to do to accomplish that, given that big upper ridge that we are seeing. And I'll bring the paint box up now so I can illustrate this a bit better. So here we have this is the European model. This is Saturday morning. And it's that upper high really builds robustly through the South Atlantic back over into the southeastern part of the U.S. So it's narrow, but it's an east-west ridge. Your upper air winds, I'm drawing the arrows as to which direction the upper air winds are blowing, and of course, you've got Dorian, which is going northwest, and then it's going to turn west-northwest. I'm being a little jagged here. It's hard for me to keep my hand straight. And then underneath that ridge, it just keeps on going. If the ridge is a little weaker, let's say instead that, let's suppose that, and this is an idea that the GFS had last night, but you see how the western extent of this ridge goes into the southeastern part of the United States. Suppose it doesn't build quite as far to the west, okay? And then it leaves a weakness here. This is where you could see Dorian perhaps, which is what the GFS was kind of arguing last night, that it would take longer, it would stay more on a northwest course and head up further north. At the end of the day, from the standpoint of the viewpoint of the Mid-Atlantic northward, you've got a westerly flow from Virginia on north. So, look, the bottom line is that if you have this set up, and I just took off the example of the weaker ridge, but even if you do have the weaker ridge, if you have this set up like this, there is absolutely no way that Dorian can get through here, okay? It just can't. The upper air winds are going to drive it west-northwest direction, as long as this upper high is strong enough and robust enough as it builds back westward into the southeast. If it doesn't build quite as strongly, then we can revisit that idea. And again, the other issue is north of Virginia, the winds are all west to east. So it's not as if something can turn and come all the way up the east coast like this. You need to have a trough in order for it to impact the mid-Atlantic and the northeast. You need a trough of some sort that, in general, looks like this, where it comes down here, and then you've got a southerly flow along the eastern seaboard, where the storm would react to that and turn northward and then shoot up the coast. So you basically need a deep trough to the west, extending down from the Ohio Valley, maybe down into Alabama, the Florida Panhandle. Obviously, we don't have that this time around. So we don't have to worry about anything coming up and impacting my area, that I cover in general, which is basically eastern Pennsylvania to southern New England. The European is pretty far to the south, by the way, because it takes it probably of all the models that I looked at, this one has the position that is furthest south into the Gulf of Mexico. And we're not going to speculate at this point about what's going to happen beyond trying to figure out the landfall, because there really is no point. Is it possible that we could have a situation where it's a double, where it goes over Florida and goes into the Gulf of Mexico? Yeah, of course it is, given the upper height of the north. But until we're sure of just exactly what we're dealing with as far as the ridge is concerned, there's no point in kind of speculating beyond the landfall. It doesn't really serve much of a purpose at this point. Here's the Canadians' view of the upper high, and here too, it's pretty strong. It's actually fingered all the way back almost to the Mississippi River. By the time we get to Saturday night, and Sunday, it's still built pretty strongly in the southeast, and it also drives it maybe a shade further north than the European and keeps it still on this west-northwest course. It still has the high off the South Carolina coast come early Monday morning. Now, the GFS today went back away from what it was doing last night, which was it was not building the ridge up much or as much, and turning it sooner and keeping it off Florida and pushing it up into Georgia or South Carolina. Here it is this afternoon, but the last two runs having a rather robust looking upper high sitting off the North Carolina coast. It's maybe a shade less strong. I don't want to even say weaker. A shade less strong, I think, is a better way to describe it. And certainly strong enough where it brings the storm Dorian on shore, but further to the north. So I think you can kind of get a gauge here of what my feelings are with respect to Florida being the area that we're really paying serious attention to, and shying away from it going up into, say, Georgia or South Carolina as a possible point of landfall. It's all about the ridge. That's really what it boils down to. So here we go with the upper pattern overall, which, again, those westerlies come pretty far south into the eastern part of the United States. You see the jet extending down almost into Virginia, so you have that narrow zone in between. And going into the long haul, it's still this flexing back and forth. It pulls up, it drops back in, pulls up again. We're at day 10 now, and really when you look at it, it hasn't really changed all that much. We have another run here where it wants to go to a ridge in the east position at the end of the forecast period. Well, guess what? We've been down that particular road before a few times on model runs, so I'm not going to take it really very seriously beyond day 8 or 9. I seldom do, but the point is that at least in the short and medium run, the pattern's going to remain the same. So the bottom line, at least at this point, is if I were along the east coast of Florida, I certainly would be paying very close attention here. And the possibility of a storm crossing the state has to be considered. So from east to west, So I would also, inland, you might want to pay attention to what's going to come of this when it's all said and done. And there's no issues, at least going through the rest of the week and into the start of Saturday. After that, then we'll start to deal with the storm getting closer and closer. Now let's review also, if it finishes loading, which it's trying to do. I'm running it backwards, which oftentimes can be useful from a forecast perspective. So let's run it. I'm going to start it off starting with tonight, of course. We have a cold front coming through, and for the east, tomorrow and Friday, it's a really good-looking day here. Good-looking days coming up tomorrow and Friday. Warm, beach weather, but not humid, not overly humid anyway. The dry air extends pretty far south because of the origin of that high going as far south as it did. So you've got low dew points down into the interior of North and South Carolina with this for the next day and a half or so. And then, of course, the next front comes through Friday night. There's not much with it, but we get a big high that's building up into upstate New York and New England. Onshore flow begins on Sunday. So look, as far as my area is concerned, our weather is going to be fine Thursday and Friday with mainly sunny skies and temperatures in the low to mid 80s. Saturday is going to be a really good-looking day with lots of sunshine, bone-dry humidity, and temperatures only in the 70s. There's going to be a little bit of residual moisture left, though, from Maryland and Delaware, maybe even to southernmost New Jersey, southward, where there'll be some clouds, and you can see the GFS actually has a couple of showers being indicated there. This high goes out quickly, unlike the one from last week, so it's part of the setup along the East Coast that's driving Dorian into Florida. And then we have another cold front that will arrive for Wednesday. So between there, Sunday and Monday for my area, we'll have to deal with onshore flow, which I think means we'll have at least some clouds in the mix, some sun, and maybe the risk of an odd scattered shower here and there. I'm not really overly concerned about any kind of continuous rain. And the next cold front will arrive probably on Wednesday, and that goes through with another high building in. And on it goes. And, of course, the way the GFS handles this, you've got the remnant low of Dorian still churning away in the southeast. Of course, if that winds up happening, there are going to be big rain issues for somebody. But, again, that's, I think, something we need to wait to work out on until we figure out exactly where the landfall is going to take place. I would point out, by the way, as we were talking back over the last couple of weeks of how quiet things were in the month of August, and we suddenly have blown through 3 names. We've had 3 named storms this week, okay, in the last 7 days. So you went from absolutely nothing, and having people say, having some people say that they didn't, we weren't going to see a tropical storm or hurricane ever develop this season, and as often happens, it goes from being very quiet, and then suddenly you've gone through 3 named storms. Now, looking ahead, I did notice that the European gets a little busy here. The GFS has something coming off in the next 5 days off the African coast that tries to move it westward. I believe it didn't really do very much with it. The European, I think, is probably the better one to look at here. And it does have, by day 7, 8, and 9, it does have 3 systems out there, including a rather robust one coming off the African coast later in the forecast period. So look, whether they're there or not, I don't know if they're going to be correct on which one they may be correct on, but I would just say that the basic takeaway here is that we're going into a busy phase. We've already begun a very busy phase. We've gone from absolute quiet, and now we're going to be seeing, one system after another pose the potential threat for becoming a tropical depression or a tropical storm going forward. And it makes sense because we're going into September, which is statistically the most active month of the hurricane season. Now, let me try this again. Maybe it will let me do it this time, and I think it might. I want to go down and look at some of the OBS the observations down in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands. So let's give me 1 second here to set this map up and which it's trying to do, and we'll see if I can be successful with this. Okay, I'll make it darker so you can see it better. And this is what it looks like right now in terms of the radar, because we've been having these showers. Actually, Long Island got some rounds of heavy rain coming in off the water, some tropical moisture in that whole boundary along the East Coast that includes the tropical depression Erin, feeding up some hefty rains this afternoon over parts of near my neck of the woods. And let's run down here and look at some of the observations. I'm going to try and close off some of these satellite loops. Maybe that'll help speed things up a bit. Okay, get rid of this. All right, so this is actually the current radar. For the current radar presentation, which really looks pretty impressive. That the center or eye is certainly evident here. Notice how far north it is, by the way, of Puerto Rico. There were some gusty winds at Roosevelt Roads about 2 hours ago, but nothing really crazy. Right now it's a south-southwest wind at 7 miles an hour. At King Airport in St. Thomas, where I saw gusts pass hurricane force earlier today, they're 20, wind speed of 20. I don't see any gusts being reported, still getting some light rain there. St. Croix, also much better than earlier, south at 10. And in Puerto Rico, we have Campo Santiago with a 4 mile an hour west wind. And at the Acadilla Rafael Hernandez Airport, we have a east wind at 5 miles per hour. No report out of San Juan. Clearly, by the way, no risk. Nothing's going to really be happening of consequence in the Dominican Republic. But take a look at where the core of this storm is, folks. It's way out in the open waters. The core is having absolutely no interaction with the land at all. So this is I think a bullish, something you could put in the camp of continued strengthening going forward, with the core remaining intact and seeing a really good presentation here as far as the radar echoes are concerned. Okay, I want to bring up a couple of other maps before I come over to the chat board, so give me 1 second here while I maneuver. Some days I maneuver better than others when it comes to this sort of stuff. I think you guys may have noticed that. So let's start with WPC, the Weather Prediction Center, and see maybe they give us a clue as to what they're thinking. And of course, if you look at how they have the heavy rain structured, it looks like they want to favor a hurricane that would come in maybe just north of Lake Okeechobee, so north of Miami, but south of Daytona, somewhere in there, or south of Cape Canaveral, to bring it in from the east from the east southeast to the west northwest. Rainfall amounts in that yellowish hatch area. That's all. Let's see. That's the first. That's at least 5 to 7 inches, or 7 to 10 inches. Let's just say a general 5 to 10 inch rainfall in that hatched area on both the East Coast and also along the West Coast. So there would be some indication that you would probably, at least according to the folks at WPC, that you're going to be taking something across the entire state. Otherwise, look how dry it is in Tennessee, Alabama, in the interior parts of the Tennessee Valley and parts of the lower Mississippi Valley. They're forecasting not a drop of rain in the next 7 days, which, when you think about it, makes sense if they're under the influence of some kind of upper ridge that is building back westward. Then you've got some rains being indicated up in Maine and down into southeastern New England on the order of a couple of inches or so because of where the frontal boundary lies right now. They're getting that tonight. In fact, there are flood watches up for Maine for some heavy rains. A little bit of, still have that bullseye area in the plains that never seems to go away. a little bit of scattered shower activity, but on the light side throughout the Rockies and then going up into the Northwest. The severe weather issue tonight, as we take a look at what the Storm Prediction Center is doing, and of course it is 7:40 Eastern Time, so remember folks, you want to go to weather.gov and go to your local National Weather Service office if you're watching the replay to check on severe weather. But except for that small area of marginal risk in New Mexico, they are not forecasting any severe weather issues today. Just general thunderstorm activity possible, and that's about it. And as far as the satellite loop goes, as we bring that up for you, because we're waiting for this clearing to happen. I want to get that low humidity and warm weather for tomorrow. Look at all that dry air that's across the Ohio and Tennessee Valley coming in, the upper trough swinging across the northern Great Lakes, the cold front pushing into the east. You can see Erin offshore, that little swirl, what's left of it, and the thunderstorms that sheared off are to the south. And on the lower right, you begin to see Hurricane Dorian. And by the way, Dorian is it's a name that can be either male or female. I did see Paul Roman, you referred to it as a she. This is why I also I've always referred to hurricanes they use a name, but I don't ascribe a sex to them, so I just refer to them as it rather than a he or a she. But the Dorian is a female name is a male name in this sequence, and Erin is the female name. So you had Chantal, girl, Dorian, boy, Erin, girl, and I don't remember what the F storm is. I got enough to deal with tonight. All right, so let me come back. We'll come back now to the chat. And here we go. Let's get your page to load here so I can see you guys. All right, let me just off the bat say a quick thank you to Paul Roman, Julianne Steele, Lou Garu, and Christopher, all hitting Super Chat tonight. I really very much appreciate it greatly. Thank you so much. It gets me a cigar for the drive home, and I'm a happy camper. And we've got just under 200 people on board tonight, which is nice to have, and glad to see everybody here. And Ruthless Scout, thank you for hitting Super Chat tonight. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. It does go a long, long way in helping me with all the stuff that I'm doing. And by the way, since I'm going to be leaving my Fios One News job, you may not have heard, but we are shutting down as of November 15th. The Fios is going in a different direction. And frankly, and to be honest, I had been toying with the idea of ending it here and devoting all my time to my websites and the app and my videos and my live streams, because that's what I really enjoy and really love. And if I'm not going to do it now, when am I going to do it? So this actually was the push I needed to get out the door. Ben McGinnis up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We need a lot of rain here because we're in drought conditions. Only 16 millimeters of rain this month. That's dry, bone dry. You should get something with the moisture from Erin moving up and that frontal boundary that you're kind of sitting in. So I think you're going to be getting at least some rainfall. And given where you are, you got this long dry stretch, which is highly unusual. It's hard to imagine that it's going to last forever. Eventually, it will break down. But we've had this consistent west to east flow, so we haven't really had any setups in the jet stream to bring stuff up from the south. So at least you got that going for you for today. All right, just running back here. I just want to see if I missed any questions. And please, if you do have questions, by all means, put them up here in the chat. Elizabeth Harrison, I think we'll have a brutally cold winter in the Northeast, and I, for one, have a Duraflame kerosene lighter and tons of extra fuel oil lamps and everything you can imagine. I bet you do. Well, look, I just want to say from that respect that it's a number of people have tried to make a correlation between the kinds of hurricane seasons we have and what kind of winters we're going to have. So I'm not going to go down that particular road. It's also, it seems that when we've had blocking in the upper atmosphere, which is usually favorable for colder weather in the Northeast in the wintertime, and in much of the eastern part of the United States for that matter, if the blocking's strong enough, when you have blocking in the summertime, and we've had it in the past, it has usually disappeared and reversed by the time we've gotten to the winter months. Now, that being said, it's not the only factor. We have had, and I've said this many times, I have always felt that the North Atlantic Oscillation was vastly overstated and overrated when it comes to cold weather in the East, that I would much rather have the East Pacific Oscillation, or the EPO, as opposed to the NAO, but I'd rather have the negative EPO at work, and I'll take my chances with regards to whether we've got the NAO or not. I think the EPO, the East Pacific, the pressure changes in the Pacific are far more important than than the NAO is. The NAO is usually a short-term type of thing, but and it's also highly volatile. Sometimes it only lasts for a week or two, but I'd rather have that long-term negative EPO. Frank Russ, the Northeast Quadrant is the worst weather. In a symmetrical storm, that certainly is the case. Sometimes it might not be, depending on what's going on in the upper air. You could see all sorts of distortions going on in terms of where the strongest winds are, be it in the Northeast Quadrant or the Southeast Quadrant, or sometimes even in the Western quadrants, the Southwest and the Northwest, under certain circumstances. Usually when they get into the higher latitudes, you could have the strongest winds show up there as the storms are transitioning from a purely tropical to eventually post-tropical. Mark Montori, I'm in Palm Beach now, boarded up the house, driving up to my other home in New York in about 3 hours before the mad rush. Thanks for all. Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you for the kind words, Mark, and hope everything goes well for you. We, again, nothing yet in stone. I would think that starting tomorrow we could begin to zero in on where we think this is ultimately going to wind up. Thank you, Joyce Mack, for the kind words. I'm looking forward. Those of you who follow me on my other platforms, I'm at this all day, 24/7, and loving every minute of it. So now I'm going to I won't have to sit in my car for 3 hours every day driving back and forth, paying $12 in tolls to go to and from work. So this is a huge plus for me, and I'm at the point in my life too. I'm 61 years old. I'm not 25 or 35 or even 45. Kids are out of the house, and it's I can do things now that I don't have to worry about paying college tuitions anymore or paying off loans or anything like that. So knock on wood, I'm going to take advantage of that. Water temperature between Daytona and Jacksonville, 81 to 83. That's right near the coast. That's right in the shelf water. So that, Scott, you got to be a little careful with those numbers, if only because local winds can impact that. But if you go out offshore, water temperatures are in the middle 80s. But even 81 and 83 is certainly supportive, and there's going to be it's going to support a strong storm. If we wind up seeing this strengthen to a Category 3, that's probably what you are going to see making landfall when we get to that point. And at this stage, I also want to say that when it comes to those decisions that you have to make with tropical storms and hurricanes, okay, make sure you consult your local officials, the National Weather Service, your local National Weather Service office, or the National Hurricane Center, or all three. I can't help you with that because I don't know your area. You know your area far better than I could. So I'm in no position to make any kind of observations, recommendations, and so on. That's what your local officials are for. That's what your tax money pays for. So be sure to consult your local officials when it comes to making decisions. Do not use the forecast maps that you see on the internet, except for the Weather Service's official forecast from the Hurricane Center. But looking at model maps and where they print out lows and the hurricane models and where they show the tracks, don't make your decisions based on those maps, because they are not. That's not their function. You want to use the Weather Service's official forecast, and that's on weather.gov. And also, when it comes time, there is a storm surge tool that allows you to see how much inundation could occur in your particular area. So when that becomes activated on the Weather Service page, on the National Hurricane Center's page, I will bring it up and we could take a look at what kind of surge forecasts are going to be there. Ashante Stevens, I believe the system may fly the scale and take aim at Florida similar to Andrew or Katrina and then end up in the Gulf. Yeah, look, this could, if that ridge is strong enough, it could be one that crosses the entire state and then comes out on the Gulf of Mexico side. That is possible, and that does happen from time to time. It's not an unusual occurrence to see a storm cross the state of Florida and cross the whole state and then wind up in the Gulf of Mexico. Thanks for the kind words, Chuck. Appreciate it. I'm just doing what I do and enjoying every minute of it. Can we rule out a Cat 4? Asked Frank Russ. I would say, I'll say this. We're going to watch to see what it does tonight and tomorrow in terms of this strengthening trend, and if it continues this slow strengthening trend. Is a Cat 4 out of the question? I don't think it is. I think it's possible, okay? I think it's possible. Certainly the upper air is favorable for this to turn into a major hurricane. Where the top is, I don't know. I'm not expert enough to look at the real intricacies of the dynamics when it comes to figuring out, is it going to be a 3 or a 4 or a 5? I would say that conditions generally are favorable to get it to at least a Cat 3. And could it push the upper end of the envelope? Yeah, it could. So we're certainly going to be talking about that possibility more and more as we get closer and closer, assuming that we could see this strengthening trend continue. When I glanced at the maps, Joyce Mack, in passing today, I thought the Outer Banks. Well, earlier, the overnight models, Joyce, the GFS in particular, wanted to bring it in near the South Carolina coast and just kind of straddle it northward from there because it had that upper high so much weaker. But that was just it did that for a couple of runs, and the European's been pretty consistent. Has been pretty consistent with being pretty much on a straight west-northwest shoot, going across the Atlantic to the Florida coast, and then out east into the Gulf of Mexico. John Curry, 919 on the HWRF. As I said this before, and I've said it a few times, be really, really careful using the pressures that, especially with the HWRF, which is notorious to showing really, really deep pressures that wind up not coming anywhere close. I would just kind of shy away from what the models are doing specifically in terms of the numbers. Let those numbers play themselves out, however they play out. If the recognition should just basically be that there's a major hurricane, there's a potential for a major hurricane. The Hurricane Center has said this. I'm not saying anything controversial. It's on their advisories and on their discussions. So I think we'll look at it that way, and then we'll see how it all handles and all plays out. But the models are certainly supportive of the idea that it could be a major. Is the Gulf of Mexico warm this year? Yeah, it's the water temperatures in the Gulf are, I think, it's a little bit warmer than average. So it's certainly going to be supportive of anything that, if something were to move across Florida and head out into the Gulf. I just want to do this off screen. Hang on one second. Let's see if the latest one. I don't know where you got that 919 from, though, because I have the HWRF, and I don't see a 919. I mean, it gets it down to the low 940s, and then, but I don't see where you got that 919. You know, so I'm just wondering. And again, we shouldn't be, don't focus on the number. If it has a well-defined center, Ashante Stevens is trying to clear out the inner cortiformant eye. Yeah, it's pretty obvious from the satellite and radar that the core is really, really solid here. Inland flooding, also a great concern. Doug Crum, I think that's a good point. And if you're going to take a storm inland, certainly you are going to have some issues. Coming in from the east, it creates all sorts of storm surge issues. And, of course, then we're going to have to deal with the rain issues, depending on how long it takes to cross the state of Florida. If the ridge starts to fall apart after it makes landfall, you might see the thing slow down or even stall out. I'm just, again, this is sort of me speculating here openly. Those are all possibilities that I think are on the table. Johnny Quest, you asked a really good question, Johnny, off camera. I'm swallowing a French fry. Hang on. So, the chat that we had when I opened the live stream, when I scheduled the live stream, I opened the chat. The chat board is open, so you can jump on and join in the conversation before the live stream even starts. And Johnny asked a very good question about what is the eyewall replacement cycle? What does that refer to? Well, think of thunderstorms. There's a birth phase, a strengthening phase, a mature phase, and then a weakening phase. And during those phases, the thunderstorms, they reach their peak intensity, then they die out. And then oftentimes, if you're following a line of storms, you might see some cells die out and new ones start up ahead of it, or the line might jump. Well, in the hurricane, what happens in the eye, of course, in the eye of the storm, the wall surrounding the eye, you have these intense thunderstorms that develop, and those thunderstorms have a life cycle, and they eventually use up whatever energy that's there, and they reach their peak intensity, and then they start to weaken. Well, in big storms, especially in powerful storms, in Cat 4s and Cat 5s and Cat 3s also, when you reach that peak intensity, those thunderstorms decay, but the basic core structure of the hurricane remains. So the eye wall weakens and collapses, and a new eye wall forms. In that process, usually what happens is the central pressure of the hurricane will increase for a while. In other words, it will seem like it's weakening. The pressures will rise, and then once the eye wall replacement cycle is complete, then those pressures fall back down, usually to where they were. And sometimes, if conditions are really favorable for strengthening, it may be the start of another strengthening phase that will take the pressures even lower. So I think we're going to experience this. If it becomes a Category 3 hurricane, you are going to be dealing with eye wall replacement cycles, and when they happen, I'll be sure to point them out. And if you're looking on your own, see if you can, we'll read about them on the Hurricane Center's discussion, and then watch it on a tight satellite loop, and you'll be able to see the eye wall disappear and a new one forming in its place. Okay, it's 8 o'clock Eastern Time. We're just about coming up on 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it. Weather in 5 tomorrow morning. We'll give you an update on Dorian. At this point, Dorian will be in the open waters of the Atlantic. So we'll be able to, there won't be a whole lot to talk about other than it's not as if it'll be making landfall. And I doubt that there'll be any kind of watches up that far out. So that early on, maybe late in the day, but not, I don't think, for the first part of Thursday. So we'll have that on Weather in 5. So look for that on YouTube tomorrow morning. That's a pre-tape video. It's not live. We'll have our regular live stream tomorrow night at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. Patreon members, that's my subscription weather platform for $2 a month. You get extra stuff, of course, and extra videos, especially in situations where there's big weather going on like we have now. So for Patreon members, there will be a weather in 10 tomorrow, much like there was today. It's your secret video, okay? But for those of you who might be interested in joining the Patreon platform, I just put the link up on the chat, and there's a link also up on the descriptor to this live stream, or if you're watching it on a replay, the descriptor to this video. All right, have a great night, everybody. I'm going to go catch some dinner, and we will see you tomorrow.